He did not shout. That was the thing Alice Grant remembered most clearly afterward, when she tried to remember any of it at all. Henry Colston, Duke of Rothmere, stood in the doorway of his own study, with his hand raised toward the front door of the house she had worked in for 3 years, and he said nothing whatsoever. He did not accuse her. He did not ask her to explain the ledger open on his desk, the one with her handwriting in it, and a column of figures that did not belong to her. He simply pointed once, and waited for her to understand that the pointing was the entire conversation. She had understood. She had gone upstairs, packed the small trunk she had arrived with 3 years before, and come back down to find the hall empty and the carriage already at the door, because he could not even bear to watch her go. 6 months later, she still woke some mornings with her hand already reaching for a ledger that was not there. She had taken one with her anyway. Not the one on his desk, the false one. The one with her hand forged into it so carefully that she had needed a full minute of staring to be certain it was not her own writing. She had taken her own, the true one, the plain leather account book she had kept every rent entry in for 3 years, tucked under her arm as she walked out the door, because it was the only thing in that house that had never once lied to her. Mrs. Prewitt, the housekeeper, had met her in the hall on the way out, and had not asked a single question, only pressed a small parcel of bread and cheese into her hands, and squeezed her fingers once, hard, before stepping back. It was the only kindness offered to her that morning, and Alice had carried the memory of it, tucked alongside the ledger, through every one of the 6 months that followed. Rothmere Hall's new steward, a careful, unhurried man named Mr. Dunmore, had been in the post 4 months when he found the discrepancy that would undo everything. It was a small thing at first, a parcel of mortgaged land on the eastern boundary, 40 acres of poor drainage that the estate's old accounts listed as sold off 2 years prior to cover a debt, had its deed reissued that spring under a name Dunmore did not recognize. He might have thought nothing of it, except the same unfamiliar name appeared on the deed for the mill cottage, and on the deed for the 3 tenant farms along the river, and on the deed, dated only 6 weeks earlier, for the gatehouse land itself, the ground the front drive of Rothmere Hall was built upon. A. Grant, the deeds read, every one of them, in a clerk's careful copperplate. Dunmore was not a man given to speculation, but he sat for a long while in the estate office with the stack of papers spread in front of him, the fire gone low and the window gone dark, before he gathered them and carried them upstairs to the Duke. Henry did not recognize the significance at first either, not until he saw the name written 7 times across 7 different parcels of his own land, and something in his chest went very still and very cold. Where, he said, did the funds for these purchases originate? Dunmore had already asked discreetly at the solicitor's office in the county town, and had come prepared with what little the clerks there had been willing to confirm. A private client, Your Grace, paid in full each time, no debt attached, no leverage sought against the estate. The purchases were made through a small firm of land agents over the course of 5 months. I asked, as delicately as I could, whether the client wished her interest in the matter kept confidential, and was told she had never once asked for concealment, only that the papers be filed correctly, in her own name. Henry sat with that for a long moment. The fire in his own study burned down now to embers. The 7 deeds spread across his desk like a hand of cards he had been dealt too late to play properly. He thought of the morning in April, the ledger Kemp had laid open before him, the particular gentle sorrow in the man's voice as he had delivered his suspicions. He thought of how easy it had been, in the moment, to believe that sorrow rather than ask a single question of the woman it concerned. He had told himself at the time that he was acting swiftly to protect the estate's reputation from scandal. Sitting now with 7 deeds bearing her name, each one a small act of protection for land that was never legally hers to protect, he understood with a clarity that made him faintly sick that he had mistaken his own cowardice for decisiveness, and that a woman he had wronged without a single word had spent 6 months quietly saving what he had been too ashamed to defend. He did not sleep that night. By the time the sun came up over the eastern boundary, he had already decided he would go to her himself, and that he would not send a letter first, because a letter was one more silence in a string of silences she had already endured too many of. To understand any of it, a person would first have needed to understand the 3 years that came before the silence. Alice had arrived at Rothmere Hall at 25, the daughter of a Shrewsbury wool merchant's clerk who had taught her figures before he taught her letters, because he had believed, in an old-fashioned and entirely correct way, that a woman who could keep her own accounts need never depend wholly on anyone. She had come to the estate office as an under-clerk, hired to help the aging steward with the rent rolls, and within 18 months she was keeping the books herself in every way that mattered, the old steward too fond of his pipe and his afternoon naps to object to being quietly, competently replaced by a woman half his age. Henry had noticed her the way a man notices weather changing, slowly and then all at once. He had inherited the dukedom at 28, 4 years before any of this, his father dead of a fever that took 3 months to finish him, and he had come into Rothmere's affairs to find them in worse order than he had feared. Half the tenant farms behind on repairs, the timber accounts a muddle, and no one in the household able to tell him with any certainty what the estate actually owed, and to whom. Alice had been able to tell him. She had walked into his study on her 2nd week, under his direct management, with a single sheet of paper, listing every debt Rothmere carried, organized by urgency, and had stood there in her plain grey dress while he read it twice through, and had not once looked away from him while he did. It had not been declared, whatever it was between them. It had been 3 years of evenings in the estate office with the ledgers open between them, of her explaining, patiently, why a given repair could wait and a given debt could not, of him learning to trust her arithmetic before he trusted his own instincts, of small kindnesses that neither of them had named. He had brought her tea himself, once, when she worked too late to ring for it. She had mended, without being asked, the torn lining of the account book satchel he carried everywhere. It had been, Alice thought later, the quietest kind of courtship there was, built entirely out of shared work and the particular intimacy of 2 people who trusted each other's judgment above anyone else's in the house. There had been one evening, the winter before it all ended, when a late storm had flooded the estate office, and they had spent 3 hours together, moving ledgers to higher shelves by candlelight, laughing, genuinely laughing, at the absurdity of it, water pooling around their boots, while a decade of rent records sat safe and dry above their heads. Henry had looked at her that night, soaked to the knee and entirely unbothered by it, directing the footman with more authority than he himself possessed in that room, and had understood, with the sudden clarity of a man startled by his own feelings, that he did not merely rely on her. He had come, somewhere in those 3 years, to need the particular steadiness of her the way a house needs its foundation, unnoticed until the moment it is gone. He had never told her so. That, too, was a silence he would come to regret. And then, in a single April morning, it had ended without a single word of explanation. Silas Kemp had come to Rothmere 18 months into Henry's stewardship of the dukedom, recommended by his late father's own solicitor, as a man who understood debt restructuring better than anyone in the county. He was soft-spoken, precise, and always sympathetic, the sort of man who delivered bad news with a gentle sorrow that made the news itself feel like a kindness rather than a blow. He had told Henry, over the course of that first year, that the estate's debts were more tangled than they appeared, that certain repairs had cost more than they should have, that someone close to the books had almost certainly been skimming small sums for years, careful enough never to be caught, careless enough to leave a pattern. He had brought the forged ledger to Henry's desk on a Tuesday morning, laid it open to a column of figures in a hand that looked, at a glance, and in poor light, exactly like Alice's own, and had said, with real regret in his voice, that he was sorry, truly sorry, to be the one to bring this forward. Henry had not looked twice. That was the part he could not forgive in himself, 6 months on. He had not asked her a single question. He had simply pointed at the door. Alice, in those 6 months, had not spent them weeping. She had gone first to her younger sister Sarah's cottage, 2 villages over, where she slept in the narrow spare room and took in accounts work for the local corn merchant to keep herself fed, because a woman dismissed without a character reference did not find respectable work easily, and she had refused, from the very first week, to write to anyone at Rothmere Hall begging for one. The corn merchant, a brisk, unsentimental man named Mr. Hollis, had asked no questions about why a woman with such evident skill at figures had arrived at his door with no character reference and a story that did not quite add up. He had simply set her a trial week of accounts, watched her untangle 3 years of muddled invoices in 4 days that his own clerk had been struggling with for a month, and hired her on the spot at a wage that, while modest, kept the roof over her head and left just enough, if she was careful, to save towards something she did not yet let herself name aloud. She worked at his counting house 3 mornings a week and carried the rest of his ledgers home to Sarah's cottage, working by candlelight until her eyes ached, and Sarah scolded her to bed. On market days, she walked the 2 miles into the village with Sarah, and it was there, in the 3rd week of May, that she first heard the name Silas Kemp spoken by strangers, 2 farmers discussing a notice of impending sale on land along the Rothmere River. Land they did not understand why the estate would suddenly need to shed. Alice had stood very still at the edge of the market stalls, a basket of eggs forgotten on her arm, and had understood, in that moment, exactly what Kemp intended to do next, and exactly what she intended to do about it. What she had, besides the wage from Mr. Hollis and the small growing sum it allowed her to save, was the private ledger. 2 years of comparisons, dates, discrepancies she had noted down long before Kemp ever brought his forged version to the Duke's desk, because she had suspected something was wrong with the eastern boundary invoices for months before she was dismissed for supposedly causing the very problem she had been quietly documenting. She remembered the exact evening she had first noticed it, the previous autumn, comparing an invoice from a firm called Ashcott and Reeve against the actual repair work she had walked out to inspect herself, and finding the sums didn't match the scope of the labor by nearly 3 to 1. She had raised it, carefully, with Kemp himself, who had smiled and explained material costs, and thanked her for her diligence in a tone that made diligence sound faintly like impertinence. She had raised it again, 3 weeks later, when a second invoice from the same non-existent firm arrived. It was after the second time that the forged ledger appeared on Henry's desk. She had also, within 3 weeks of leaving Rothmere, understood something else. The estate's failing parcels, the ones Kemp's manufactured debt was slowly forcing toward auction, were not merely numbers to her. She had walked that eastern boundary 100 times with the tenant farmers, had sat in the mill cottage kitchen while old Mrs. Yardley told her stories of the river flooding in her grandmother's time, had known every acre the way she knew her own hands. She could not stop Kemp from destroying her reputation. She could, if she was careful and patient, stop him from taking the land. It had meant selling nearly everything she owned that was not strictly necessary, her mother's pearl earrings first, then a set of books she had loved since girlhood. It had meant 3 months of corn merchant accounts, worked late into candle-lit evenings until her eyes ached, and a small legacy from an aunt she had never expected to see so soon, and a solicitor in the county town, a plain, unglamorous man named Mr. Otway, who asked no unnecessary questions and simply executed each purchase as she directed, always in her own name, never hidden, because she had nothing left to hide, and everything to prove. She had bought the mill cottage land first, in June, because Mrs. Yardley's grandson had written to her, uncertain who else to write to, saying the family had received notice the parcel was to be sold. Alice remembered standing in Mr. Otway's cramped office above the corn exchange, watching him count out the exact sum she had brought in a canvas purse, and feeling for the first time since April something that was not quite happiness, but stood close enough beside it to be mistaken for it in poor light. There had been a night in July, though, that she didn't tell anyone about, not even Sarah. She had come to the end of a column of figures and found she could not afford the Second River farm without selling her mother's pearl earrings, the only thing of her mother's she had left, and she had sat at Sarah's kitchen table long past midnight with the earrings in her open palm, turning them over, and had wept then, quietly, in a way she had not permitted herself to weep in the 4 months since Henry had pointed at the door. It was not the land she wept for. It was the earrings, and her mother, and the particular unfairness of having to sell one true thing to save another. She sold them the following week regardless, because the farm mattered more than the ache of losing them, and she never once mentioned the ache to anyone, because grief that could not change an outcome was, in her accounting, not worth the ink to record. She had bought the 3 river farms in August, one after another, each purchase leaving her with less in the bank and more, somehow, of herself restored. She had bought the gatehouse land last in September, not because it mattered more than the others, but because it was the last piece Kemp had moved to seize, and she had wanted, when she signed the papers, to feel the particular satisfaction of taking back the very ground beneath the house that had sent her away. She had not done it to be found. She had done it because it was the only true thing left within her power to do. When Henry Colston arrived at her sister's cottage door on a grey Tuesday afternoon in October, unannounced, his hat in his hands, and no carriage waiting visibly at the gate because he had walked the last half-mile alone, Alice was sitting at the kitchen table with a column of figures in front of her, and did not, at first, believe it was truly him. "You bought the gatehouse land," he said, without preamble, because he did not know how to begin any other way, and 3 attempted openings had already failed him on the walkover. "I did." "Why?" She set down her pen. She did not stand. She did not offer him tea, though Sarah, hovering in the doorway to the scullery, looked as though she badly wanted to. "Because it was going to be sold at a loss to cover debt that was never real," Alice said. "Because I understood, better than you did, what Mr. Kemp was doing to this family, and I understood it because I had been trying to tell someone for 6 months before you sent me away for it." The words landed exactly as flatly as she meant them to. Henry did not flinch from them, which surprised her more than anything else he might have done. "I know," he said. "I have known for 11 days. Dunmore brought me the deed registry copies, and I saw your name written 7 times across 7 parcels of my own land, and I understood, all at once, precisely what I had done. I have spent every one of those 11 days trying to find the right way to come here, and I haven't found it, so I am simply here instead." "That is not an apology." "No," he agreed. "It is not. I do not think there is an apology that fits what I did. I looked at a ledger a man I trusted handed me, and I did not ask you a single question before I ended 3 years in a single morning. I told myself I was protecting the estate's name. I was protecting my own comfort, because doubting Kemp meant admitting I had let him manage half my family's affairs on nothing more than my late father's word, and doubting you meant sitting with you and asking hard questions I did not want to ask. It was easier to point at a door." Alice looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen was very quiet. Somewhere outside, a cart passed on the lane, and Sarah, in the scullery doorway, had gone very still, watching her sister's face for some sign of what to do next. "You are 6 months late," Alice said. "I know that, too. I did not buy this land to be thanked for it. I did not buy it to be forgiven for something I never did. I bought it because it was the only way left to me to prove, to myself if to no one else, that I had told the truth. Do you understand the difference, Your Grace? I was not building a case for you. I was building one for myself, because I refused to let a lie be the last true thing that had ever been said about me in that house." "I believe you," Henry said. "I should have believed you in April. I am asking you to let me believe you now, and to let me help finish what you have already nearly finished alone, because Kemp is not done. Rent day is in 9 days, and he intends to force the tenants along the river into arrears they do not owe, on figures he has been falsifying for 4 years. I cannot undo 6 months by walking half a mile to your sister's door, but I can stand beside you when the truth is finally said aloud, if you will permit it." "And if I refuse," Alice said, "will you point at another door?" It was not entirely a fair question, and she knew it as she asked it. But she watched his face for the answer regardless, because she had spent 6 months learning to trust nothing that was not proven to her directly. "No," Henry said without hesitation. "If you refuse, I will go to rent day alone, with Dunmore's receipts and whatever courage I can manage, and I will very likely make a worse showing of it than you would, because I have never in my life caught a man in a lie the way you caught Kemp in his own invoices. But I will not send anyone away from anything ever again without asking first. That much I have learned, if nothing else." Alice was quiet for a long moment, turning her pen over once between her fingers, the same small habit he remembered from 100 evenings in the estate office. "I will come," she said finally. "Not because you asked prettily. You did not ask prettily at all. But because those families along the river deserve better than to be robbed twice, once by Kemp and once by a room too polite to say his name aloud, and I find I still care more about that than I care about being properly courted." "That," Henry said, and something in his face eased for the first time since he had walked in, "sounds exactly like you." It was not a declaration. It was not, Alice thought afterward, anything close to what she might once have imagined he would say to her, if he ever came at all. It was a request for her competence, offered plainly, without flourish, exactly the way he had always, in 3 years of working alongside her, asked for anything that mattered. It was, she found, more than enough to begin with. Rent day at Rothmere Hall had always been held in the long room above the estate office, tenants filing through in order to settle their accounts for the quarter, and this year Silas Kemp had arranged to be present for it, ostensibly as the Duke's financial adviser, in truth to ensure that 3 families along the river signed papers acknowledging debts that existed only in his own falsified ledgers. He had not expected Alice Grant to be standing at the Duke's shoulder when the doors opened, her chestnut hair braided plainly back, a familiar plain leather ledger resting closed beneath her hand on the long table. "Miss Grant," he said, and something in his voice, careful as it was, could not entirely smooth over the flicker of alarm beneath it. "I confess I am surprised to see you returned to Rothmere, given the circumstances of your departure." "The circumstances of my departure," Alice said, "were a ledger you forged in 11 days, Mr. Kemp, using invoices from a firm of contractors, Ashcott and Reeve, who do not exist and never have. I have their non-existence documented, along with the actual contractors who performed the eastern boundary repairs, at 1/3 the cost your figures claimed. The room, full of tenants who had known Alice Grant for 3 years as the steady young woman who had never once shorted them a farthing in an account, went very quiet. Kemp's composure did not break immediately. He was, Henry had to admit, watching him with cold new clarity, a genuinely skilled liar, and he reached for the ledger in his own case with the easy confidence of a man who had talked his way out of worse rooms than this one. "I have my own records," he said. "The repair invoices were submitted in the amount of £84, 6 shillings, precisely as I documented at the time, and I would remind this room that Miss Grant left this house under a cloud of suspicion regarding these very accounts, a fact she conveniently omits from her account of things. Nobody had said the figure £84, 6 shillings aloud. Alice had never named it. Not in this room, not to Henry, not to Dunmore. It existed nowhere but in the forged invoices themselves, the ones Kemp had just confirmed, without meaning to, that he still possessed, and still remembered with a precision no innocent man would ever carry for a figure he claimed to have set down and forgotten a year ago. Henry saw the tenants' faces shift, one by one, as the arithmetic of it settled over the room. Mr. Dunmore, standing at the back with the true contractor's receipts in his hand, stepped forward without being asked, and laid them, unhurried, on the long table. Kemp's hand moved, then toward the ledger's inner pocket, the reflex of a man reaching to make a paper disappear before it could be examined too closely, and it was that motion, small and unthinking, that the whole room watched him make. "You may keep your figure, Mr. Kemp," Henry said, very quietly, into the silence that followed. "I have the actual receipts, the real deed transfers, and a solicitor's statement regarding 4 years of manufactured debt against this estate. I would ask you to leave Rothmere Hall today, and I would ask you to consider very carefully whether you wish the county magistrate to review these documents before you do." "This is theatre," Kemp said, and there was, for the first time, a thinness in his voice that had not been there a minute before. "A dismissed clerk returning with a grudge and a stack of papers she has doubtless assembled to suit her own account. Your Grace, I would remind you that I have served this family's interests for 4 years, faithfully, at considerable personal exertion, and I will not stand here and be accused by a woman whose own competence you yourself once questioned." "I questioned nothing," Henry said. "I was handed a lie, and I did not have the courage to examine it. That failure is mine, and I have made my peace with owning it in front of this room. Yours, Mr. Kemp, is rather larger. Mr. Otway?" The solicitor, who had been standing quietly near the back of the long room since the doors opened, stepped forward with a leather folder of his own, and laid beside Dunmore's receipts a second set of documents, correspondence between Kemp and the intermediary firms through which the skimmed funds had ultimately traced back to accounts bearing his own name. 4 years, Mr. Kemp," Alice said, and her voice, when it came, was not raised, was in fact almost gentle, the way a person speaks when they have waited a very long time to say something and no longer need to shout it to be heard. 4 years of invoices from firms that never existed, debts manufactured against families who had done nothing but trust the man their duke trusted. I do not say this to punish you, though I will not pretend I take no satisfaction in it. I say it because these tenants deserve to hear, in this room, in front of you, precisely what was done to them, and precisely why it was never their fault, or mine. Old Mrs. Yardley, seated near the front, with her hands folded in her lap, said nothing, but Henry saw her reach over and take her grandson's hand, and saw the boy's shoulders drop with a relief that had clearly been held too long. Kemp did not run, because there was, in the end, nowhere obvious to run to. He left the long room with as much composure as he could assemble, which was not a great deal, his gold watch chain catching the light one last time as he reached the door, and the tenants along the river signed nothing that quarter but their true, unaltered accounts, in Alice's own steady hand, restored to the desk she had once been marched away from, without a word. The formal proceedings took longer, of course. There were solicitors, and a magistrate's inquiry that ran the better part of 3 weeks, Kemp's own clerk eventually turning King's evidence when it became clear the intermediary accounts could be traced regardless of his cooperation, and a slow, painstaking unwinding of 4 years of careful theft that occupied the estate office for the better part of the following month. Henry sat through every session of the inquiry himself, insisting on it even when his own solicitor suggested his presence was not strictly required, because he had decided, somewhere on the walk back from Sarah's cottage in October, that he would never again let anyone else's account of a wrong stand in for his own witnessing of the truth. Mrs. Prewitt, the housekeeper who had never once believed the theft, brought tea to the office every evening that month without being asked, and said nothing about it beyond a single quiet remark, the first week, that she had always known there was more truth in that ledger than in the man who accused it. But the room's verdict, the moment the tenants of Rothmere had watched a guilty man name a figure no innocent man could know, had already rendered the judgment that mattered most. Alice did not move back into Rothmere Hall immediately. She returned at first, only to finish what she had begun, working alongside Dunmore to untangle the true accounts from the false, riding out each morning from Sarah's cottage and back again each evening, and it was 3 more weeks before Henry asked her, one evening in the estate office, with the last of the day's ledgers closed between them and the fire burned low, whether she intended to stay only until the accounts were fully settled, or whether she might consider staying for reasons that had nothing to do with figures at all. "I bought this land because I loved it," Alice said. "Not because I loved anyone in this house. I know. But I find that the two things are no longer as separate as I once believed them to be." He did not reach for her hand across the desk with any grand gesture. He simply set his own hand down beside hers, close enough to touch, and left it there, and waited, the way he had learned, at last, to wait for things worth waiting for properly, instead of ending in a single, silent morning. The wedding, the following spring, was a quiet one, held in the chapel at Rothmere rather than in London at Alice's own request. She wore, at Henry's insistence, deep burgundy silk rather than the pale colours tradition suggested, because he had told her once that he wanted, on the day he married her, for her to look exactly as unmistakably herself as she had looked the day she walked out of his house with her own ledger under her arm. Mrs. Yardley's grandson stood among the tenants who came to watch from the chapel yard, and Mr. Hollis sent, unbidden, a crate of the finest apples from his own orchard, with a note that said only that he had known from the first trial week of accounts that she would land somewhere considerably grander than his counting-house, and that he was glad, in the end, to have been right. Sarah stood beside her sister at the altar rail, and Mrs. Prewitt wept openly through the whole of the short ceremony, dabbing at her eyes with the same handkerchief she had once pressed bread and cheese into Alice's hands with, on a morning neither of them had ever needed to speak of again. 6 months after that, Alice sat at a wide desk in what had once been the estate office, and was now simply called by the household her study, the eastern light coming warm through the window onto a ledger open in front of her. It was the same plain leather book she had carried out of Rothmere Hall the day she left it, filled now nearly to its final page with 2 years of careful, patient truth, and beside it lay a newer one, begun the week of her return, its first entry recording the restored deed to the gatehouse land in her own steady hand. The garden below the study window had been Alice's own project that first spring, the old rose beds along the south wall neglected for years under Kemp's mismanagement, the estate's small funds always somehow diverted before they reached the gardeners, the beds gone to bramble and couch grass by the time she first walked their length with a critical eye and a firm intention to see them righted. She had walked the beds herself in March with the head gardener, an old man named Fenn, who had worked at Rothmere since before Henry was born, and had asked him not what looked handsome, but what would actually thrive in that particular soil and that particular light, and the two of them had spent an hour with a spade and a notebook, testing the ground the way she had once tested a column of figures, methodically, without sentiment, until the answer was certain. By June the beds were full again, unshowy and correct, exactly the kind of restoration that rewarded patience over spectacle, and Henry had told her, watching her kneel in the dirt in an old grey dress, not unlike the one she had worn the day he first read her list of Rothmere's debts, that he had never seen anything look so entirely like coming home. Henry came to find her there most evenings, not to check her figures, which had never once in 3 years needed checking, but simply to sit across from her while she worked, the small brass-nibbed pen she wore now on a cord at her collar, catching the last of the light. "Dunmore tells me the eastern boundary drainage is finally repaired," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "Properly this time, and at 1/3 of what Kemp once claimed it cost." "I know," Alice said, not looking up. "I approved the invoice this morning." "Of course you did." She glanced up then, and something in her face, quiet and unhurried and entirely certain of its own place in the world, was the thing he had come to find every evening, more than any figure in any ledger, more than any deed with her name written across it in a clerk's careful hand. "You could simply trust that I have it handled," she said. "I do," Henry said. "I have never once doubted it since the day you came back and told me so yourself. I only like to hear it." She set down her pen at last and reached for his hand across the desk without needing to be asked, the way she had once reached for a ledger without needing to be told which figures mattered. Outside, Fenn could be heard somewhere among the rose beds, calling instructions to a boy about the proper depth for autumn planting, and the sound of it, ordinary and unremarkable, was exactly the sound Alice had once thought she would never hear again from this particular window. Outside, the gatehouse land lay quiet under the last of the evening light, drainage running clean and true beneath it for the first time in years, and somewhere below the study window, a cart passed along the drive she had bought with her own 2 hands, on ground that had never, in the end, needed anyone's rescue but her own.